November 24, 1963, 2 days after Dallas. Frank Morrison stood in the rain outside Sam Giancana's Chicago compound, CIA-issued Colt, 45 in his coat pocket, watching 5 of his best operatives disappear through the back entrance. The mission was simple. Walk in, eliminate the witness, walk out, clean up loose ends before Giancana could talk about what he knew regarding Cuba and a certain president's personal life. 48 hours later, all 5 men were found dead, wrapped in American flags, arranged like a memorial outside the White House gates, each one shot execution style, each one carrying Frank's business card. The newspapers called it a mob retaliation. The FBI called it justice. But Frank knew better. Someone had set them up. Someone wanted those men dead and wanted Frank to know about it. For 60 years, Frank Morrison carried that secret. Tonight, that secret is coming for his family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hook. The fluorescent lights in the Washington Post basement archive hummed their familiar tune as Frank Morrison's arthritic fingers traced the edge of the manila envelope that shouldn't exist. 30 years of cataloging classified documents in this tomb of forgotten headlines had taught him to recognize trouble, and the envelope sitting on his desk at 11:47 p.m. screamed it. His granddaughter Sarah's keychain photo smiled at him from beside his coffee mug. 26 years old, bright-eyed Capitol Hill staffer with her whole life ahead of her. The same age he'd been when he'd stood in that Chicago rain, watching good men walk to their deaths. Frank's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. 5 black and white photographs spilled across his desk like accusations. 5 bodies wrapped in American flags, arranged with military precision outside the White House gates. The same 5 operatives he'd sent into Giancana's compound 60 years ago. The same 5 men whose deaths had haunted every sleepless night since Dallas. But these weren't newspaper clippings or FBI crime scene photos. These were different angles, close-ups, professional shots taken by someone who'd been there, someone who'd wanted these deaths documented from every angle. Beneath the photographs lay a file folder bearing a classification stamp he hadn't seen in decades. Operation Mongoose. Eyes only. Frank's throat constricted. He'd watched CIA Director Mac Cohn personally feed these files into an incinerator in 1964, had seen the ashes scattered to ensure no trace remained. Yet here it was. His mission brief, his target assessment of Sam Giancana, his psychological profile noting the mob boss's increasing paranoia about government surveillance, and paper clipped to the back, a handwritten note in faded ink. The old man talks too much about Cuba, about Monroe, about favors owed. Handle this quietly. Make it look like an accident. Rach. Frank's blood turned to ice water. R.H. Robert Helms, CIA Deputy Director of Plans in 1963, the man who'd personally briefed Frank on the Giancana operation. The man who'd assured him the order came straight from Kennedy himself. The basement archive's security door chimed softly. Frank's head snapped up. The building should be empty except for the skeleton night crew, and they never ventured down to the archives. He quickly swept the photographs back into the envelope, his combat instincts awakening after decades of dormancy. Footsteps echoed down the concrete corridor, measured, professional, the kind of walk that belonged to someone comfortable in the shadows. Frank slipped the envelope into his jacket and moved toward the emergency exit, but the footsteps were already at his door. A soft knock followed. 3 short, 2 long. The old CIA recognition signal from the Kennedy era. Come in. Frank's voice betrayed nothing, but his right hand found the grip of the .38 special he still carried after all these years. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, expensive suit, silver hair pulled back severely. She moved like someone accustomed to being the deadliest person in any room. Hello, Frank. It's been a long time. He recognized the voice before his eyes confirmed it. Elena Vasquez, CIA wet work specialist, recruited straight out of Army intelligence in 1961. She'd been beautiful once, before the work had carved lines around her eyes and taught her to smile without meaning it. Elena. Frank kept his distance. Thought you were dead. Heard Beirut got messy in '89. Reports of my demise were greatly exaggerated. She stepped into the archive, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "We need to talk about what you just found." "Don't know what you mean." "The envelope, Frank. The photographs. The file that was supposed to burn with the rest of Operation Mongoose." Her voice carried the weight of shared history and present danger. "Someone's been very busy cleaning house, and your name is next on the list." Frank's grip tightened on his weapon. "Who's behind this?" "The same people who sent those 5 men to die in Chicago. The same people who've spent 60 years making sure certain truths about November 1963 never see daylight." Elena moved closer, her hands visible but ready. "Your granddaughter Sarah works for Senator Harwick's office, doesn't she? Foreign Relations Committee? Access to classified briefings?" The mention of Sarah's name hit Frank like a physical blow. "Leave her out of this. It's too late for that. They already know she's your weakness. 26 years old, ambitious, idealistic, just the kind of person who might ask uncomfortable questions if something happened to her grandfather." Frank's world tilted. 60 years of buried guilt and carefully managed secrets suddenly felt as fragile as tissue paper. "What do you want?" "To keep you both alive long enough to finish what we should have finished in 1963. Elena's expression softened slightly. "But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. Because, Frank, the people who killed those 5 operatives, they're already here in Washington, and they know exactly where you work." The lights in the archive flickered once, then died, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the suffocating darkness of the archive, Frank Morrison's world compressed to heartbeat and breath. 72 years of living had taught him to measure danger in degrees: the casual threat of a diplomatic briefing, the elevated risk of a field operation, the mortal certainty of a blown cover. This felt like standing at the edge of an abyss. "Emergency lighting should kick in," he whispered, though they both knew it wouldn't. Someone had cut the power with surgical precision. Elena's voice came from his left, barely audible. "Service tunnel behind the microfiche cabinets. Move." Frank's fingers found the familiar geography of his workspace in the dark. 30 years of muscle memory guiding him past filing cabinets that held the detritus of American foreign policy failures. The manila envelope crinkled against his ribs with each step, a paper time bomb counting down to consequences he couldn't yet fathom. As they moved through the maze of archived secrets, Frank's mind drifted to Sarah. She'd be asleep now in her DuPont Circle apartment, probably with case files scattered across her bed and CNN murmuring on the television. Wednesday mornings meant early committee hearings, and she'd rise at dawn to review briefing materials over coffee that was too strong and toast she'd burn while reading classified cables. The image of her laugh echoed in his memory, the sound she'd made 3 weeks ago when he'd attempted to explain Instagram during their Sunday dinner at Founding Farmers. She'd inherited her grandmother's dimples and her father's stubborn streak, but her eyes held something uniquely her own, an unshakable faith that government could serve good, that people like her could make a difference. Frank had never told her about the shadows that lived in the margins of that faith. Elena's hand found his shoulder, guiding him toward a ventilation grate he'd never noticed in 3 decades of cataloging nightmares. "Your granddaughter," she said as she worked the screws with practiced efficiency. "She doesn't know what you used to do. It wasn't a question. Elena had always been thorough. She thinks I was a State Department analyst. Boring paperwork, diplomatic minutiae." Frank's voice caught slightly. Her parents died believing the same thing. The grate swung open with a metallic whisper. Elena disappeared into the tunnel with fluid grace. Frank followed more carefully, his joints protesting the tight quarters and the weight of years he couldn't shed. "You protected her from the truth," Elena observed as they crawled through decades of accumulated dust. "But truth has a way of finding the next generation, especially when it's soaked in blood." Frank thought of the 5 photographs, of bodies wrapped in flags like grotesque gifts. Men who'd had families too. Children who'd grown up wondering why Daddy never came home from his business trip to Chicago. "Those 5 operatives," he said. "I've carried their names for 60 years. Williams, Chen, Rodriguez, McKenna, and Kowalski. Good men who trusted me when I told them the mission was sanctioned by the president himself. You believed it too." I wanted to believe it. The admission tasted like copper pennies. Kennedy was dead. Johnson was consolidating power. Helms said the mob connections to Dallas needed to be severed before Congress started asking questions. Said Giancana knew too much about our attempts to kill Castro. They emerged into a sub-basement Frank had never known existed. Steam pipes hissed overhead like mechanical serpents. The air smelled of machine oil and decades of accumulated secrets. Elena led him toward a service elevator, its brass buttons green with patina. The mission was legitimate. Your intelligence was solid. Giancana was indeed becoming a liability. Then why are those 5 men dead? Because someone wanted them dead more than they wanted Giancana dead. The elevator lurched upward with arthritic protest. Someone who knew that eliminating a team of witnesses was cleaner than eliminating one very visible mob boss. Frank closed his eyes, seeing Sarah's face again. She'd inherited more than her grandmother's dimples. She'd inherited a legacy of violence she couldn't understand. In 6 hours, she'd wake up in a world where her grandfather's sins had finally come home to roost. Elena, if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, or to her. The elevator shuddered to a stop. But Frank, you need to understand something. This isn't about revenge. It's about 2024. About power. About elections. Your granddaughter works for Senator Harwick, who chairs the Foreign Relations Committee. She has access to intelligence briefings that could expose certain operations from the 1960s that are still classified. The elevator doors opened onto a parking garage Frank didn't recognize. A black sedan waited in the shadows, engine running. Someone's been planning this for decades, Elena continued, waiting for the right moment, the right leverage. Frank felt the last of his carefully constructed civilian life crumbling like old paper. They're going to use Sarah to get to me. No, Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of hard truth. They're going to use you to get to her. Frank stared at the idling sedan, its exhaust forming ghostly clouds in the underground garage's stale air. The weight of Elena's words settled into his bones like winter cold. They're going to use you to get to her. 30 years of protecting Sarah through distance and lies, and now his very existence had become the weapon pointed at her heart. Get in. Elena moved toward the passenger side, but Frank remained frozen at the elevator threshold. I won't run. Not if it puts her in more danger. Frank. His phone buzzed. The sound cut through the garage's mechanical hum like a blade. Frank pulled the device from his pocket with hands that had steadied sniper rifles and diffused diplomatic crises, but now trembled at the sight of an unknown number on the screen. Elena's eyes went hard. Don't answer it. But Frank was already swiping to accept the call, some terrible intuition telling him this moment had been orchestrated with precision. A voice emerged from the speaker, cultured, patient, tinged with an accent he couldn't place. Mr. Morrison, I trust Ms. Vasquez has been helpful in facilitating your evening constitutional. The garage seemed to contract around them. Frank's combat instincts screamed that they were exposed, vulnerable, exactly where someone wanted them to be. Who is this? Someone who's been waiting a very long time to have this conversation. You may call me Alexander. I represent certain interests that have been monitoring your archival work with great attention. Elena was already moving, circling her finger in the air, keep him talking, while she scanned the garage's shadows for threats that could materialize from any direction. What do you want? Frank's voice carried 6 decades of authority, but the tremor beneath betrayed him. What I've always wanted, Mr. Morrison, the completion of unfinished business. You see, when you failed to eliminate Mr. Giancana in 1963, you created a rather significant problem. The old gentleman lived another 12 years. Carrying secrets that certain powerful people preferred remain buried. Frank's blood turned to ice water. Giancana was killed in 1975. Indeed he was. Shot 7 times in his Oak Park basement while cooking sausages. But by then, he'd already shared certain inconvenient truths about November 1963 with insurance policies of his own. Written records, recordings, evidence that could reshape history textbooks if it ever surfaced. The manila envelope in Frank's jacket seemed to burn against his ribs. Elena had reached the sedan and was checking the interior, her movements sharp with controlled urgency. Those 5 men, Frank said. The photographs. You killed them. I killed no one, Mr. Morrison. I simply inherited a situation that required management. You see, your 5 operatives didn't die in Chicago in 1963. They completed their mission, or what they believed to be their mission. But when they returned to Washington, they began asking inconvenient questions about why Giancana was still breathing, about why their intelligence reports were being buried, about why their handler, you, had seemingly vanished into bureaucratic obscurity. Frank's knees nearly buckled. They're alive? We're alive. Until 48 hours ago, when they became liabilities rather than assets. By then, of course, they'd spent 60 years building lives, having families, accumulating knowledge about operations that certain people prefer remain classified. Elena was gesturing frantically now, pointing to her watch. They'd stayed too long, talked too long. But Frank couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process the magnitude of the revelation crashing over him. My granddaughter has nothing to do with this. Ah, but she has everything to do with this. Alexander's voice carried the satisfaction of a chess master revealing checkmate. Miss Sarah Morrison, age 26, staff aide to Senator Harwick, security clearance level TS-SCI, with access to congressional intelligence files dating back to the Kennedy administration. Files that include certain sealed testimonies about Cuba, about organized crime, about governmental operations that blur the lines between policy and murder. The garage's fluorescent lights flickered, and Frank realized with sick certainty that they'd been here too long, that this conversation was cover for something else happening elsewhere in the city. She's reviewing those files, isn't she, Mr. Morrison? Preparing briefing materials for next week's Foreign Relations Committee hearing on declassified Cold War operations. Such a diligent young woman. Such attention to detail. Frank's world tilted on its axis. The hearing. Sarah had mentioned it 3 weeks ago during dinner. A routine review of declassified materials, the kind of bureaucratic housekeeping that happened every few years. She'd been excited about the responsibility, about proving herself worthy of higher clearance levels. If you touch her, I don't need to touch her. You're going to deliver her to me yourself. The line went dead. Frank stared at the phone's dark screen, 60 years of carefully compartmentalized guilt collapsing like a house of cards. Elena was beside him now, her hand on his arm, but he couldn't feel her touch through the numbness spreading from his chest. Frank, we need to move, now. But Frank Morrison, former CIA operative, veteran of a dozen black operations, keeper of state secrets that could topple governments, could only think of Sarah waking up in 6 hours to a world where her grandfather's sins had finally found her address. Early development. Frank stood motionless in the garage, Elena's urgency washing over him like distant static. The phone's dark screen reflected his face, hollow, aged, defeat carved into lines that hadn't existed an hour ago. Everything felt wrong, tilted, like walking through a funhouse where familiar shapes transformed into threats. "This isn't happening," he whispered. "I can fix this. I can—" "Frank, listen to me." Elena's grip tightened on his arm. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they trace this location. Whatever you're thinking, whatever noble sacrifice is brewing in that stubborn head of yours, forget it." But Frank was already pulling away, muscle memory from decades of crisis management taking over. There had to be a protocol for this, a procedure. In 30 years of archival work, he'd cataloged every CIA contingency plan from 1947 to 1989. Surely one of them covered protecting civilian family members from blowback. "I'll call Harwick's office. Get Sarah reassigned. Send her somewhere safe until—" "Until what?" Elena's voice cut through his desperate planning. "Frank, you're not thinking like an operative. You're thinking like a grandfather, and that's going to get you both killed." The sedan's passenger door hung open like an invitation to a world Frank had spent 30 years trying to escape. He'd built a careful life in those archives, surrounded by the documented failures of better men than himself. Every morning at 8:15, coffee in the same ceramic mug, organizing the sins of his generation into neat manila folders that could be filed away and forgotten. "There has to be another way." Frank's voice cracked slightly. "I can't. Sarah doesn't deserve to inherit this." Elena moved closer, her expression softening with something that might have been sympathy. "None of us deserved what we inherited, Frank. But standing in this garage won't change the fact that someone's been planning this for 60 years. Frank's phone buzzed again. Not a call this time, A text message from an unknown number. His hands shook as he opened it. The image loaded slowly. Sarah's apartment building, photographed from across the street. Timestamp, 3 minutes ago. A second message followed immediately. She's reviewing files right now. Such dedication. The phone slipped from Frank's numb fingers, clattering against the concrete. Elena caught it before it hit the ground, her face darkening as she saw the images. Surveillance only, she said quickly. They need her functional, cooperative. If they wanted her dead, she'd already be... Don't. Frank's voice came out raw. Don't finish that sentence. Around them, the garage's mechanical sounds seemed to amplify. Ventilation fans, steam pipes, the distant hum of elevators carrying late-night security guards through a building that held more secrets than Frank could catalog in 3 lifetimes. Normal sounds, safe sounds. The acoustic backdrop of a world where his granddaughter woke up every morning believing her government served justice. I spent 30 years protecting her from this, Frank said, more to himself than to Elena. Moved across the country after her parents died. Changed my name on the university faculty roster so she'd never connect Frank Morrison in the archives to Grandpa Morrison, who told bedtime stories about imaginary diplomatic missions. Elena's expression suggested she'd known about the name change, the careful distance, the Sunday dinners where Frank never quite answered direct questions about his career. Of course she'd known. People like Elena made it their business to know everything. Protection through ignorance only works if the threats stay buried, she said. But Frank, this was never about you. It was never about Giancana. Someone's been playing a 60-year game and Sarah's just the final piece. Frank thought of the hearing Sarah had mentioned. Routine declassification review, boring bureaucratic housekeeping. Except nothing involving Operation Mongoose had ever been routine. The mob connections, the Castro assassination attempts, the blurred lines between patriotism and murder, all of it classified at levels that could topple governments if the wrong people started asking the right questions. She's looking for discrepancies, he realized. In the files, that's what she does. Finds inconsistencies in intelligence reports, flags them for committee review, and 60 years of carefully managed lies create a lot of inconsistencies. Frank's resolve cracked like old concrete. Every instinct screamed at him to run. To Elena's sedan, to some CIA safe house, to whatever protection the agency might still offer a 72-year-old archivist who knew too much. But running meant abandoning Sarah to forces she couldn't understand, leaving her to discover the truth about her grandfather through obituaries and classified cables. The garage's fluorescent lights flickered again, and Frank heard something that made his blood freeze, footsteps echoing from the stairwell. Multiple sets, moving with professional precision. Elena was already at the sedan, engine running, passenger door open. Frank, now or never. But Frank Morrison stood paralyzed between 2 impossible choices, watching the stairwell door for shadows that would force him to become the man he'd spent 30 years trying to forget. The stairwell door burst open with military precision. 3 figures in dark suits moved through the entrance like water finding its level, professional, unhurried, carrying themselves with the particular confidence of men who'd never encountered meaningful resistance. Frank recognized the type immediately. Corporate security masquerading as federal agents, the kind of deniable assets that powerful people used when official channels required too much paperwork. Elena's sedan was 30 feet away. Might as well have been 30 miles. Mr. Morrison. The lead figure's voice carried a slight southern drawl, the kind that suggested expensive schools and inherited connections. I'm Agent Coleman, Treasury Department. We need to discuss some irregularities in your security clearance renewal. Frank almost laughed. After 60 years in the intelligence community, they were opening with Treasury Department credentials. Either they were amateurs, or they assumed he'd become senile enough to believe federal agents conducted interviews in parking garages at 3 in the morning. Treasury doesn't work weekends, Frank said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. And they sure as hell don't work unauthorized overtime in private buildings. Coleman's smile never wavered. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us for a brief consultation. We have some photographs we'd like you to examine. The manila envelope in Frank's jacket felt like it was radiating heat. These men knew exactly what he'd found in the archives. which meant they'd been watching him for longer than the past few hours. Someone had been planning this encounter, choreographing it, waiting for Frank to discover the photographs so they could justify whatever came next. Elena materialized beside the sedan's hood, her movements so fluid that Coleman's men didn't register the threat until she spoke. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Her voice carried an authority that made all three men shift their posture slightly. Frank recognized the tone. It was the same voice she'd used during briefings in Langley, back when she'd been high enough in the hierarchy to make field agents nervous. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." Coleman kept his eyes on Frank, but his peripheral vision tracked Elena with professional awareness. "Mr. Morrison needs to answer some questions about classified materials that may have been compromised." Interesting theory. Elena's hand rested casually on the sedan's hood, but Frank could see the tension in her shoulders. "What's your treasury badge number, Agent Coleman?" The question hung in the garage's recycled air like smoke. Frank watched Coleman's face, saw the micro-calculation happening behind his eyes. This wasn't how the encounter was supposed to develop. Someone had briefed these men on Frank Morrison, retired archivist, not Frank Morrison, former CIA operative with 3 decades of field experience. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification." Elena smiled, and Frank felt the temperature in the garage drop 10 degrees. "I'm Elena Vasquez, Deputy Director of Operations, Central Intelligence Agency, and you gentlemen are operating without jurisdiction, without backup, and without nearly enough firepower." Frank's breath caught. Elena's cover identity had always been consulting work. Private sector, deniable, divorced from official agency channels. If she was burning that protection now, revealing active CIA credentials, the situation had escalated beyond anything Frank had understood. Coleman's hand drifted toward his jacket. Not quite a threat, but not quite casual either. "Ma'am, we're going to need verification of those claims." "Of course you are." Elena's phone appeared in her hand with the same fluid motion. "Frank, do you remember Director Harrison's direct number?" Frank's mind raced. Marcus Harrison had been CIA director for 8 years, a career intelligence officer who'd climbed the ranks during the worst of the Cold War. If Elena was threatening to wake the director at 3 in the morning, she was either bluffing on a cosmic scale or this operation had presidential-level authorization. "I remember," Frank said quietly. The garage fell silent except for the mechanical humming of the building's infrastructure. Frank could see Coleman weighing options, calculating risk versus reward. 3 men with questionable credentials against a CIA deputy director and a former operative who might or might not still have agency protection. Then Frank's phone buzzed again. The sound cut through the standoff like a gunshot. Every person in the garage turned toward the device in Frank's pocket, and Frank realized with sick certainty that Alexander had been waiting for this exact moment. The photographs, the phone call, even this confrontation, all of it orchestrated to force Frank into a corner where his only choice was cooperation. Coleman's smile returned, wider now. "I think you'll want to answer that, Mr. Morrison. Something about your granddaughter working very late tonight." Frank's hands were trembling as he pulled out the phone. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, but when he answered, Alexander's cultured voice filled the garage. "Good evening again, Mr. Morrison. I trust you're beginning to understand the scope of our conversation." Through the phone's speaker, Frank could hear Sarah's voice in the background, muffled, confused, asking questions that no one was answering. Frank's blood turned to ice as Alexander's voice continued through the speaker, each word precisely enunciated like a professor delivering a lecture on inevitable consequences. "I hope you don't mind the interruption, but your granddaughter has been asking the most fascinating questions about her research, particularly about discrepancies in Operation Mongoose personnel files." Elena's expression shifted from tactical alertness to something Frank had never seen before, genuine alarm. She moved closer, close enough to hear Sarah's voice more clearly through the phone's speaker. Sarah was asking someone to please explain what was happening, her tone carrying the forced politeness of someone trying to maintain professional composure while fear crept up her spine. "Let me speak to her," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, you will. But first, I think it's time you understood the true scope of your failure, Mr. Morrison. You see those 5 men in the photographs, your team, they didn't just fail to eliminate Giancana, they discovered something far more damaging. Coleman and his men had moved closer, forming a loose semicircle that blocked any escape route toward the stairwell, but Frank barely registered their presence. All his attention focused on Alexander's voice and the terrible certainty that 30 years of careful lies were about to collapse. The mission was never about Giancana, Alexander continued. It was about you. Frank's knees nearly buckled. What? November 1963, Mr. Morrison. 3 weeks before Dallas. You were selected for Operation Mongoose not because of your skills, but because of your psychology profile. A man who would follow orders without question, who would accept failure as personal weakness, who would carry guilt so completely that he'd spend the rest of his life in bureaucratic exile. The garage's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made Coleman's smile look grotesque. Elena was speaking urgently into her own phone, but Frank couldn't process her words through the roaring in his ears. The agency needed a patsy, Alexander said. Someone to take responsibility for a mission that was designed to fail from the beginning. You see, certain powerful people needed Giancana alive in November 1963. He had work to do, arrangements to make, a president to help eliminate. Frank's vision blurred. 60 years of carefully maintained beliefs crumbled like old concrete. You're lying. Your handler in 1963. Do you remember his name? Frank's mouth moved soundlessly. Of course he remembered. William Brennan, Deputy Director of Plans, the man who'd recruited Frank straight out of Yale, who'd shaped his career through a dozen black operations in Latin America and Southeast Asia. William Brennan, Alexander continued, who died in a car accident 6 months after Dallas. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Eliminated everyone who knew the truth about your real mission. Elena grabbed Frank's arm, her grip tight enough to leave bruises. Frank, don't listen to this. He's manipulating you. But Frank was remembering details that had never made sense. The mission briefing that came without written orders, the extraction point that was never confirmed, the communication protocols that failed precisely when he'd needed them most. And afterward, the debriefing that felt more like interrogation, the reassignment to archival work that was presented as temporary but became permanent. The beautiful irony, Alexander said, is that your guilt made you the perfect keeper of secrets. 30 years in those archives, surrounded by classified materials about every operation except your own. You never once questioned why your mission files were missing, did you? Never wondered why a failed assassination attempt required such complete documentary purging. Through the phone, Frank could hear Sarah's voice growing more distressed. She was asking about her grandfather, asking if someone could please call him, asking why her research had triggered this kind of response. Here's what's going to happen, Alexander continued. You're going to walk away from those photographs, forget everything you've learned tonight, and return to your quiet retirement. In exchange, your granddaughter will complete her research and file her report, with certain modifications that I'll provide. Frank's hand tightened on the phone until his knuckles turned white. And if I refuse? Then Sarah will learn the truth about her grandfather's real career, about the missions in Guatemala and Nicaragua, about the villages that were destroyed to protect American interests, about the families that disappeared because Frank Morrison filed intelligence reports that required permanent solutions. Elena was shouting into her own phone now, demanding immediate backup, citing threat levels and authorization codes that Frank had never heard before. But Alexander's words cut through everything else like a blade finding vital organs. She'll learn that the man who raised her, who told her bedtime stories about diplomatic missions and peaceful negotiations, is responsible for more deaths than any mob boss Sam Giancana ever dreamed of ordering. Frank's legs gave out. He sagged against the concrete wall, the phone slipping in his sweat-slicked palm. Because Alexander wasn't lying, not about this. Frank had filed those reports, had provided intelligence that led to operations he'd never questioned, never followed up on, never allowed himself to fully understand. Coleman stepped forward, his hand extended. The photographs, Mr. Morrison. Time to put this all behind you. Frank stared at Coleman's outstretched hand, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the man's expectant face. 30 years of archived guilt crystallized into a single moment of absolute clarity. Every bedtime story he'd told Sarah, every careful deflection about his career, every Sunday dinner where he'd smiled and pretended to be the gentle diplomat she believed him to be. All of it built on corpses he'd helped create with nothing more than intelligence reports and plausible deniability. Frank. Elena's voice cut through his paralysis. Whatever you did 60 years ago, whatever reports you filed, that's not who you are now. But Frank was remembering Guatemala, 1962. A village whose name he'd never learned, marked only as coordinates in his intelligence assessment. He'd reported unusual radioactivity, suspicious movement patterns, possible insurgent sympathizers. 6 weeks later, he'd filed a follow-up report noting that all radio transmissions from that sector had ceased. He'd never asked why. Alexander's voice continued through the phone, relentless. Are you ready to have that conversation with Sarah, Mr. Morrison? To explain how Grandpa's diplomatic missions actually worked? Frank closed his eyes, seeing Sarah's face the day she'd graduated from Georgetown, glowing with pride as she talked about following in his footsteps, serving her country through careful research and honest analysis. She'd been 22, the same age Frank had been when he'd filed his first intelligence report that had gotten people killed. The photographs, Coleman repeated, stepping closer. We can make this all disappear. Your granddaughter finishes her research, files a sanitized report, continues her promising career. Everyone wins, except the truth, Frank whispered. Elena moved to his side, her voice urgent but gentle. Frank, you can't save those villages now. You can't bring back those families. But you can save Sarah. Through the phone, Frank heard Sarah's voice again, clearer now. She was reading something aloud. File numbers, dates, personnel assignments. Her voice carried the clinical precision she used when cataloging discrepancies. But underneath it, Frank detected the tremor that meant she was beginning to understand that her routine research had uncovered something terrible. She's already too deep, Frank realized. Even if I give you the photographs, she's seen the files. She knows the inconsistencies exist. Alexander's laugh was soft, almost paternal. Oh, Mr. Morrison, you still don't understand. Those inconsistencies, we created them. Every missing document, every redacted passage, every personnel file that doesn't quite match the operation reports, all carefully orchestrated breadcrumbs leading your granddaughter to ask exactly the right questions at exactly the right time. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. You wanted her to find the discrepancies. We needed someone with impeccable credentials to formally request declassification of the remaining Operation Mongoose files. Someone whose research would trigger automatic congressional review. Someone whose investigation would provide legal justification for opening sealed archives that have been protected for 60 years. The garage seemed to tilt around Frank. Sarah hadn't stumbled into danger through bad luck or curiosity. She'd been selected, guided, manipulated into becoming the key that would unlock everything. Elena's phone buzzed with incoming messages. Frank could see her face darkening as she read, her professional composure finally cracking. Frank, my backup isn't coming. Someone's blocking the authorization codes. Coleman's smile widened. Deputy Director Vasquez, I think you'll find that your authority doesn't extend quite as far as you believed. Frank looked at the photograph still clutched in his jacket pocket, then at Elena's increasingly desperate attempts to reach her contacts, then at Coleman's patient confidence. Alexander was right about one thing. The scope of this operation extended far beyond anything Frank had imagined. 60 years of planning, 60 years of positioning pieces on a board so vast that Frank was only now beginning to glimpse its edges. But Sarah's voice through the phone changed everything. She was no longer asking polite questions. She was making demands, her tone carrying the steel that Frank recognized from her mother, his daughter, who'd never backed down from a fight in her 34 years of life. I need to speak to my grandfather, Sarah was saying, right now. And I need someone to explain why a routine declassification review requires this level of security theater. Security theater. Frank almost smiled despite everything. Sarah had figured out that her captors weren't federal agents. She was buying time, looking for leverage, refusing to be intimidated by men who'd underestimated her intelligence, just like her grandfather had been underestimated 60 years ago. when he'd been selected as a patsy for an operation designed to fail. Frank straightened against the concrete wall, his hand steady as he brought the phone closer to his mouth. "Alexander, I want to make you a counteroffer." The garage fell silent except for the mechanical humming of the building's infrastructure and the distant sound of Frank's granddaughter refusing to be afraid. Alexander's silence stretched for 10 seconds before his cultured voice returned, carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "I'm listening, Mr. Morrison." Frank pulled the photographs from his jacket, holding them up so Coleman could see the black and white images of 5 men wrapped in American flags. The fluorescent lights made the blood look like spilled ink against the White House gates. These men, my team, they figured it out, didn't they? They discovered that Giancana wasn't the real target, that the whole operation was designed to position assets for Dallas. Elena's breath caught beside him. Even Coleman's confident smile faltered slightly. "They came back to Washington, not because they failed," Frank continued, his voice growing stronger, "but because they succeeded in learning the truth. And you killed them for it." Through the phone, Alexander's tone shifted to something colder. "Ancient history, Mr. Morrison. What's your offer?" Frank looked directly at Coleman, studying the man's face as he spoke. "You need Sarah's research to justify opening those sealed files. But you also need her to reach specific conclusions that will exonerate certain people and implicate others. You've spent 60 years building this narrative, and now you need official documentation to make it permanent." "Your point?" "My point is that Sarah isn't stupid. She's already questioning the security theater, already recognizing the inconsistencies in your operation. Push too hard, and she'll realize she's being manipulated. Her research will become worthless to you." Frank could hear Sarah's voice in the background, more insistent now. She was demanding to know why her computer access had been restricted, why her office phone wasn't working, why federal agents were treating a declassification review like a national security emergency. "But if you let me talk to her," Frank continued, "let me explain enough of the truth to satisfy her questions, she'll complete the research willingly. She'll file a report that serves your purposes because she'll believe she's serving the truth." Elena grabbed his arm. "Frank, no. You can't manipulate her like that." But Frank was watching Coleman's face, seeing the man calculate odds and outcomes. The operation was already showing stress fractures. Too many moving pieces, too many variables they couldn't control. Sarah's intelligence was becoming a liability rather than an asset. "What specifically are you proposing?" Alexander asked. Frank's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I tell Sarah that I was involved in Operation Mongoose, that it failed because of security leaks, that the sealed files contain evidence of those leaks, and her research is helping to finally expose the truth after 60 years. And in exchange, you let her live. You let her complete her work and build her career without interference. And when this is over, you let both of us disappear." The garage fell silent except for the building's mechanical systems and the sound of Frank's heart hammering against his ribs. Elena was staring at him with something between admiration and horror, recognizing what he was really offering, to become complicit in the very deception that had destroyed his life 60 years ago. Coleman lowered his hand, no longer reaching for the photographs. Behind him, his men shifted position slightly, creating space for negotiation rather than confrontation. Then Sarah's voice cut through the phone's speaker, clear and sharp. "I know you can hear me, grandfather, and I know this isn't about declassification." Frank's breath stopped. Through the speaker, he could hear rustling papers, the sound of someone moving quickly through files. "I found the real Operation Mongoose roster," Sarah continued, her voice carrying across whatever room held her, "including the team that was assigned to eliminate Sam Giancana in November 1963. The team that included Frank Morrison, age 32, CIA Operations Division." Alexander's control finally cracked. "How did she—" "Because you gave me access to everything." Sarah's voice was triumphant now. "Every database, every archive, every sealed file you needed me to review. And I've been doing exactly what you trained me to do. Cross-referencing sources, checking personnel records, following paper trails." Frank felt something like pride cutting through his terror. Sarah hadn't just been manipulated. She'd been learning, analyzing, turning their own resources against them. I also know that 5 members of that team died in Washington on November 24, 1963, Sarah continued, 2 days after Dallas, and I know that only one member of the original team survived, the one who was positioned as operational scapegoat in case the mission was exposed. Frank closed his eyes, feeling 60 years of carefully constructed lies collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. Sarah knew everything. Not just the sanitized version Alexander wanted her to find, not just the partial truth Frank had been prepared to tell, but the complete, devastating reality of what had happened in 1963. Coleman was speaking urgently into his radio, calling for immediate extraction. Elena was shouting into her phone, demanding emergency backup authorization from someone higher up the CIA hierarchy. But Frank just listened to his granddaughter's voice, steady and unafraid, as she dismantled 6 decades of deception with nothing more than the research skills he'd taught her and the moral courage she'd inherited from her mother. Frank opened his eyes and smiled for the first time in 60 years. Sarah's voice continued through the speaker, methodical and relentless, as she read aloud from files that were never supposed to exist. Personnel transfers dated November 25, 1963. Burial records with classified security clearances. Medical examiner reports that listed cause of death as administrative error. Coleman's radio crackled with panicked responses. Elena's backup authorization was being routed through channels that no longer existed. Alexander's carefully orchestrated operation was collapsing in real time, undone by a 28-year-old Capitol Hill researcher who'd learned her trade in the basement archives of the Washington Post. "The beautiful thing about the truth," Frank said quietly, "is that once it starts coming out, you can't control where it goes." Through the phone, he heard Sarah's fingers flying across a keyboard. She was uploading files, sending emails, creating digital copies faster than anyone could stop her. Every cross-reference she'd made, every discrepancy she discovered, every document they'd used to manipulate her, all of it flowing into networks beyond their reach. Alexander's voice returned, tight with barely controlled fury. "You've destroyed everything, Morrison. 60 years of careful planning." "Good." Frank pulled out the photographs, holding them up to the harsh fluorescent light one last time. 5 young men who died for asking the right questions. These boys deserved better than being wrapped in flags and forgotten. Coleman lunged forward, but Frank was already moving. Not toward Elena's gun or toward escape, but toward the concrete pillar where shadows gathered thick as old guilt. He pressed his back against the cold stone and thought about all the villages he'd never asked about, all the reports he'd filed without questioning their consequences. "Sarah," he called toward the phone. "Are you safe?" "I'm fine, grandfather. I'm in a federal building with real security guards who are very interested in why fake agents have been holding me in conference rooms all day." Elena lowered her weapon, her face softening with something Frank chose to interpret as forgiveness. "She's smarter than all of us. She gets that from her mother." Frank's voice caught slightly. "Jenny never let me get away with half-truths either." The garage's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting the same harsh shadows they always had. But Frank found they no longer seemed threatening, just old fixtures in an old building, illuminating whatever truth people chose to bring into their glare. Coleman was speaking rapidly into his radio, but his words had the desperate quality of someone trying to contain a flood with paper towels. Elena holstered her weapon and stepped closer to Frank, not as protector, but as witness to whatever came next. "You know this doesn't end here," Alexander said through the speaker. "There are consequences to exposing operations this sensitive." Frank thought about consequences, about 30 years in basement archives, cataloging other people's secrets while carrying his own, about bedtime stories he'd told Sarah, carefully edited versions of diplomatic missions that had never existed, about the weight of manila envelopes and the particular quality of silence that follows violence. "Maybe," Frank said. "But now the consequences belong to all of us, not just to old men who've been carrying them alone." Sarah's voice came through clearly one last time. "Grandfather, I'm sending you something. Check your email when you get home." Home. Frank realized he couldn't remember the last time anyone had assumed he had somewhere safe to go. The garage began to empty. Coleman's men disappeared first, melting away like shadows when sunrise cuts through abandoned buildings. Elena made one final phone call, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose backup had finally arrived. Alexander's line went dead without ceremony or threat. Frank found himself alone with the photographs, standing under fluorescent lights that no longer seemed harsh but merely functional. Old fixtures doing their job, illuminating whatever truth people brought into their steady glow. He walked slowly toward the exit, his footsteps echoing off concrete walls that had witnessed 60 years of secrets. Behind him, the garage settled into the particular silence of places where important conversations had finally ended. The November air outside was crisp with early winter, carrying the smell of dead leaves and distant snow. Frank pulled out his phone and checked his email. Sarah had sent a single message with no subject line. "Sunday dinner this week? I'll cook. We have things to talk about." Frank smiled and typed back, "I'll bring dessert. And some stories that are finally true." He deleted the response without sending it, typed something simpler, "Yes." Then Frank Morrison, former CIA operative, former keeper of secrets, current grandfather, walked home through Georgetown streets that looked exactly the same but felt entirely different. In his jacket pocket, 5 photographs rested against his heart like absolution he'd never thought to request. The Washington Post building rose behind him, its basement archives holding 30 years of his careful cataloging. Tomorrow, someone else would tend those files. Tonight, Frank had family dinner plans to make.